In 1331, inside the cold chambers of a Hungarian palace, a young queen of only 21 collapsed in the agony of childbirth. She was Beatrice of Savoy, born among the snowy Alps, traded away as a bride to secure a king's power. She left no political legacy, no living heir, only a silent cradle and the fever that consumed her. Her story barely lingers in the margins of history. Why was her life extinguished before it could truly begin? The story of Beatrice of Savoy begins not in the gilded chambers of Hungary, but in the shadows of the Alps. Around 1310, when snow still crowned the mountain ridges, as if time itself had carved eternal crowns of ice, a daughter was born into the House of Savoy. Her cradle was rocked not by lullabies of freedom, but by the quiet whisper of treaties, alliances, and debts yet to be settled. The Alps themselves seemed to shape her fate. They stood tall and immovable, mountains of stone where storms gathered and lingered. For Savoy, nestled in those valleys between France and Italy, life was always about survival. Survival between giants, survival between empires. To be born a princess in Savoy meant your childhood was never truly yours. Every laugh, every promise, every whispered dream was weighed against the scale of politics. Beatrice was the daughter of Amadeus I, Duke of Savoy, a man often called the Great for his shrewd diplomacy and his ability to balance between powers far stronger than his own. He understood that castles could be besieged and armies crushed. But a daughter, married into the right bed, could secure peace for decades. For him, children were pawns dressed in velvet, moved carefully across the board of Europe's ambitions. Her mother, Maria of Brabant, came from a lineage of German nobility, a reminder that bloodlines were the currency of the age. Beatrice grew up under her mother's watchful gaze, learning manners fit for courts she had never seen, languages spoken in kingdoms she might never visit, and prayers whispered to a God she was told would protect her. But only if she obeyed her place in the divine order. Even as a child, she must have felt the weight of her surname pressing on her shoulders. Savoy was not a great empire. It had no fleets like Venice, no riches like Florence, no armies like France. Its wealth lay in its daughters. The young Beatrice, with her pale skin and alpine grace, was destined to become a treaty wrapped in flesh, a promise sealed in silk. To walk through the halls of her father's court was to live inside a theater of negotiation. Envoys from France, emissaries from the Holy Roman Empire, and messengers from Italy's turbulent city-states passed through like shadows, their words thick with calculation. Beatrice, though still a girl, was not blind. She saw how her sisters were spoken of not as children, but as potential queens, duchesses, or bargaining chips. Each one was a ladder to power, and each one was expected to climb, whether or not the ascent led to happiness. The Alps gave her beauty, but they also gave her isolation. The mountains enclosed her childhood in stone, a reminder that she lived at the crossroads of Europe, a place never quite at rest. Travelers spoke of Paris, Vienna, and Rome, cities alive with song, splendor, and intrigue. But Beatrice's world was narrower. Her horizon was always hemmed by peaks that both protected and imprisoned her. It was as though nature itself had written her fate. She would not escape. She would only be sent elsewhere. Perhaps she dreamed of a life of her own, as young hearts often do. Perhaps she lingered at windows, watching snow fall silently into the valleys, wondering if marriage might bring love instead of duty. But in the early 14th century, the heart of a princess mattered as little as the cry of a bird in winter. She existed to be given away. And so, Beatrice of Savoy grew up with knowledge sharpened early, that her youth was a dowry, her body a vessel for dynasties, her very breath a line in someone else's treaty. The Alps around her stood eternal, but she would be carried down from those peaks, traded like a jewel polished for another's crown. History seldom records her voice, but we can imagine the silence she bore. Silence of a girl waiting for her name to be called in a bargain. Silence of a daughter knowing her laughter was already promised to another man's table. Her story began in snow and silence, and already the shadow of her end stretched across the horizon. If Beatrice's childhood was framed by the mountains, her youth was defined by the ambitions of her father. Amadeus V of Savoy had earned a reputation across Europe not as a warrior who conquered, but as a ruler who endured. To survive as a small duchy in the midst of greater powers required a gift sharper than any sword, the gift of calculation. Savoy's lands stretched like a ribbon between France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Italian states. It was both prize and pawn. A land too valuable to be ignored, but too small to dominate without consequence. Amadeus understood this fragile balance. He did not dream of crushing his neighbors. He dreamed of outlasting them. His weapons were treaties, marriages, and promises made beneath flickering candlelight in cold stone halls. In this theater of diplomacy, daughters were his strongest currency. To marry a son to a princess from a minor house brought little gain. But to give a daughter to a rising dynasty could secure alliances, trade routes, or military aid. Each child was a coin, minted not in silver, but in flesh and blood. Beatrice, with her delicate lineage and alpine grace, was a treasure. Her blood carried the weight of Savoy, Brabant, and the German nobility, threads that could weave seamlessly into the fabric of larger dynasties. In her father's mind, she was not simply a girl. She was an investment, a seal of trust, a living bridge between Savoy and the thrones of Europe. Savoy itself reflected this role. Its castles stood not as monuments of dominance, but as fortresses of negotiation. They guarded mountain passes, controlled trade, and offered safe passage to merchants who dared the treacherous roads between Italy and France. The duchy lived in a constant state of bargaining, every decision a matter of survival. Amadeus knew his daughters could not remain hidden among the pines. Their futures lay in courts far beyond the peaks, where their names would be spoken in languages they barely knew. He trained them not with swords, but with silence, patience, and composure. To endure a banquet without faltering, to bow without hesitation, to smile even as one's heart crumbled, these were the lessons drilled into them. Lessons more vital than embroidery or song. The court of Savoy itself was a crossroads of culture. French troubadours carried songs of love and loss. German knights whispered tales of chivalry, and Italian merchants brought silks and spices that dazzled young eyes. Beatrice grew up surrounded by voices that spoke of worlds larger than her own, yet she knew she would never enter them freely. For her, every story was a reminder. One day she too would be sent away, her name pinned to a treaty, her body bound to a man chosen not for love, but for strategy. In those years, Beatrice must have watched her older sisters depart, one by one. Some sent to German courts, others to French nobility. Each departure was dressed in ceremony, each farewell disguised as celebration. But beneath the music and feasts, there lingered an unspoken truth. Each daughter was an exile, exchanged for safety, never to return home except in memory. For Beatrice, the waiting must have been unbearable. The Alps that had once enclosed her childhood now felt like prison walls. Every echo of a horseman arriving at the gates, every rumor of an envoy from a distant king must have stirred both dread and resignation. She lived not in days, but in anticipation of departure. It was in this climate of constant negotiation that the name of Hungary emerged. The kingdom of Childbirth of Anjou was rising in strength, binding its power with threads that stretched across Europe. For Savoy, aligning with such a throne was no mere choice. It was survival itself. And so the path was drawn. Beatrice would be offered as a bride, not because her heart yearned, but because her father's duchy required it. Her laughter, her innocence, even her hope, these were not hers to keep. They were sacrifices, placed silently on the altar of politics. Her fate was not sealed by passion or chance, but by ink on parchment, by men who signed their names while she waited in silence. The Alps had raised her, but they could not shield her. Savoy's calculations had chosen her destiny. She would leave the mountains behind and step into a world where her youth, her body, her very breath belonged not to herself, but to a throne that demanded heirs. In 1328, when Beatrice was still no more than 18, her waiting came to an end. The name spoken to her was not of a youthful prince or noble knight, but of a man nearly twice her age, Childbirth of Hungary. He was a king already seasoned in politics and wars, a monarch who had worn the crown for decades and carried with him the heavy burden of dynastic survival. To him, Beatrice was not a bride chosen by affection, but a solution to a problem, the problem of heirs. The marriage was arranged swiftly, sealed by envoys and messengers whose words weighed heavier than the hopes of the young woman they were bargaining over. For Savoy, the union was a triumph. To marry a daughter into the house of Anjou, ruling Hungary with growing strength, was to place the family name in the orbit of power. For Beatrice, it was exile. She would leave the narrow valleys of her childhood and enter a court where every gaze measured her worth by her womb. The journey itself must have felt like a funeral procession of innocence. From the high passes of Savoy, across rivers and plains, toward a country whose language was foreign to her tongue, she traveled not as a free woman, but as a living treaty. The Alps receded behind her, their peaks swallowed by distance, until they became nothing more than a memory. White crowns on the horizon, fading with every mile. When she entered Hungary, the differences would have struck her at once. The climate harsher, the palaces more austere, the customs strange to her alpine upbringing. At court, she was no longer simply Beatrice. She was the Queen, a title heavy with expectation. Every bow, every word, every gesture was watched, not to see if she was kind or clever, but to judge whether she might soon cradle a son in her arms. Charles I, her new husband, was a king in his 40s, a man who had lived through the turmoil of claiming and defending the Hungarian throne. He had seen conspiracies, rebellions, and shifting loyalties. By the time he married Beatrice, he had already buried wives and remained without a secure male heir. To him, she represented hope not for companionship, but for continuity. Their marriage bed was not the meeting place of lovers, but the crucible of dynastic survival. For Beatrice, adjusting to this foreign world must have been a daily trial. She was far from her sisters, her mother, and the familiar songs of Savoy. Hungarian was not her language. Its syllables must have sounded like stone tumbling across a riverbed. Court rituals were alien, and she was expected to learn them swiftly, never faltering in her role. A queen could not stumble, not even in a strange land. Her smile became her mask, her silence her shield. The palace halls she walked were wide and echoing, filled with courtiers whispering in corners, with servants rushing under torchlight. To Beatrice, they must have felt more like labyrinths than sanctuaries. Each corridor was a reminder that she was surrounded, yet utterly alone. The Alps had isolated her by geography. Hungary isolated her by design. And then came the feasts. Banquets that dazzled with silver goblets, roasted meats, and music echoing through vaulted ceilings. To the Hungarian nobles, these were displays of wealth and power. To Beatrice, they were theater. She sat beside her husband, her youth a stark contrast to his age. Her quiet presence a living symbol of the bargain struck between Savoy and Anjou. Every toast raised in her honor was not to celebrate her, but to remind her of what was expected. An heir, a son, a continuation of the crown. In private moments, perhaps she felt the ache of loss, the loss of home, of freedom, of girlhood. Perhaps she lingered at the palace windows, staring out at the Hungarian plains, flat and endless, so different from the mountains that had shaped her childhood. Those mountains had once felt like walls. Now she longed for their embrace. Marriage had not given her liberation. It had given her a role. And in that role, her body was not her own. It belonged to Hungary, to the Anjou dynasty, to the endless tide of history demanding bloodlines and heirs. Beatrice of Savoy had left her home as a daughter. She entered Hungary as a queen, but beneath the crown, she was still a young woman, scarcely 18, forced to grow old before she ever had the chance to live. In Hungary, Beatrice did not simply marry a man. She married into an empire of expectations. Childbirth of Anjou was not only her husband, but also the embodiment of a dynasty that stretched across Europe, from the hills of Naples to the courts of Paris. The Anjou name carried with it both glory and menace, a web of alliances and rivalries that reached beyond the borders of Hungary. And for Beatrice, it was less a family than a shadow, vast, heavy, and inescapable. The Anjous were born of ambition. They had carved thrones with a mix of blood and negotiation, building a reputation as a family destined to rule. Charles I himself had ascended to the Hungarian crown through determination and foreign support, cementing the family's presence in Central Europe. But all of that ambition, all of that restless striving, funneled down to one fragile necessity: the need for heirs. Without heirs, dynasties crumbled. Without heirs, shadows disappeared. And so Beatrice, barely 20, bore the weight of centuries of ambition pressing down on her womb. It was not unusual for queens in medieval Europe to be judged by their fertility. But in Hungary, under the House of Anjou, the scrutiny was relentless. Every glance from a courtier, every hushed conversation in the palace halls circled back to the same unspoken question: would she produce a son? In their eyes, she was not so much a queen as a chalice, her worth measured only by what she could carry within her. For Beatrice, this pressure must have felt like walking beneath a ceiling that was always threatening to collapse. She had been raised in Savoy's mountains, where storms gathered and snow weighed heavily on rooftops until they buckled under the strain. In Hungary, she found herself under a different kind of storm, one of expectations, gossip, and the silent, suffocating countdown of her youth. Charles III was no cruel tyrant. History paints him as pragmatic, focused on the stability of his kingdom. Yet even his moments of kindness could not shield Beatrice from the demands of his dynasty. He had seen queens before her, women who bore him no lasting heirs, women who faded into the margins of his reign. To him, Beatrice was hope renewed, a chance for the future. But hope can be a burden as crushing as despair. The palace itself seemed to echo with that burden. In its great halls, with chandeliers flickering above and tapestries depicting battles and saints, Beatrice moved like a shadow among rituals designed to remind her of her duty. Feasts glittered with gold, but in her ears the music was always accompanied by the steady beat of expectation. When she walked the gardens, whispers followed her steps. Will she give us a son? She was barely more than a girl, yet she was treated as a vessel for Hungary's destiny. It was as though her youth had been stolen by the very crown placed on her head. A crown, after all, is both a halo and a shackle. It glitters in the light, but digs into the flesh beneath. When Beatrice became pregnant, hope swelled not only in her chambers, but throughout the kingdom. Courtiers smiled more readily, servants carried their duties with anticipation, and Charles I seemed momentarily softened. For a queen, pregnancy was not simply personal, it was political theater. Her body became a public spectacle, her every step watched for signs of strength or weakness. But fate, as it often did in the Middle Ages, was merciless. The child did not survive. The silence of that cradle was more deafening than any funeral bell. For Beatrice, it was a private grief. For Hungary, it was a disappointment. And in that cruel contrast lay the true tragedy. The court mourned not the loss of her child, but the failure of her purpose. The loss left her isolated. In the flickering candlelight of her chamber, she must have felt the weight of invisible eyes pressing against her walls, judging her even in sorrow. Women at court, some sympathetic, others calculating, watched her with a mixture of pity and expectation. Men spoke of alliances and succession as though her body was a chessboard. The grief of a mother became another line in political discourse. To carry such grief at such a young age is to be hollowed from the inside. Beatrice, still only in her early 20s, must have felt herself drifting further into solitude. She had left behind the familiar peaks of Savoy, only to find herself caged in the plains of Hungary. The Alps had once towered like stern guardians. Now, the Hungarian horizon stretched endlessly, flat and merciless, offering no refuge. Her loneliness deepened in a court where affection was scarce and competition plentiful. Queens in medieval Europe often found themselves surrounded by rivals, mistresses, advisors, and even foreign envoys who all sought influence over the king. Beatrice, young and untested, had little armor against such forces. She could smile, she could pray, she could endure. But endurance alone cannot mend a breaking heart. The shadow of the Anjou dynasty loomed larger with every passing day. Its glory was her cage, its ambition her tormentor. In public, she was a queen draped in silks and jewels, seated beside her husband at ceremonies meant to project strength. In private, she was a girl haunted by the memory of a child she had lost, by the knowledge that her failure was not only personal but dynastic. The irony was bitter. The very dynasty that demanded heirs would, in the end, forget her. The shadow she lived under was so vast that it erased her completely once she was gone. History records her as a name, a marriage, a date of death. The grandeur of the Anjou dynasty, which had weighed so heavily on her shoulders, allowed her only a single line in chronicles. The shadow consumed not only her youth, but her memory. And yet, in imagining her life, we cannot escape the feeling that she was aware of this erasure even as she lived. A young queen in a foreign land, mourning alone, she must have known that the world valued her, not for herself, but for the dynasty she served. The crown she wore was not made of gold, but of silence. A silence that followed her into death and beyond. In the great game of dynasties, queens like Beatrice were not remembered for their laughter, their fears, or their grief. They were remembered, if at all, for the heirs they left behind. Beatrice left none. And so the shadow of the Anjou dynasty that had dominated her life became the very thing that erased her. In medieval Europe, a queen's body was not her own. It belonged to her husband, to the dynasty, and ultimately to the realm itself. For Beatrice of Savoy, that truth grew sharper with every passing month in Hungary. After the loss of her first child, her worth was no longer measured by her dignity, her youth, or her grace. It was measured by the emptiness of a cradle. The Anjou court, glittering on its surface, was in reality a hive of whispers. Every banquet, every ceremony, every walk through the palace gardens was shadowed by the same murmur. Will the queen conceive again? Her steps were not simply watched. They were calculated, as if every moment of her existence could predict the fertility of her womb. If she lingered too long in prayer, it was said she was pleading for a child. If she smiled too brightly, some claimed it was to mask despair. And if she grew pale, rumors began at once. Was she expecting? This obsession with heirs was not uniquely Hungarian. Across Christendom, dynasties rose and fell on the bodies of women. But for Beatrice, barely 20, the weight of that expectation was crushing. She had not been given time to mature into her role. Instead, she was thrust into it, like a soldier sent to battle with no armor. Every failed pregnancy was a defeat. Every empty cradle, a humiliation. Charles III, her husband, was a man hardened by politics. He had seized Hungary's crown after years of conflict, surviving conspiracies and rebellions to establish his dynasty. To him, heirs were not merely personal. They were the foundation of his reign. Without a son, his enemies could claim weakness, his throne could fracture, and the work of decades could collapse. Beatrice was his hope, but hope in this court was never gentle. It was demanding, relentless, and unforgiving. The rituals of the palace reflected this obsession. When Beatrice appeared at court feasts, her attire was scrutinized. Did it conceal a pregnancy? When she retreated to her chamber, the absence was noted. When she knelt at Mass, courtiers searched her face for signs of fatigue. She was less a woman than a vessel under examination, a chalice waiting to be filled. In her solitude, Beatrice must have felt the sting of invisibility. The courtiers saw her body, but not her soul. They longed for her womb to succeed, but cared little for her grief when it failed. It was as though her humanity had been traded away the moment she entered Hungary's palace. She was not Beatrice, daughter of Savoy, with her own dreams and fears. She was the queen, a title that erased the person beneath it. The loss of her first child lingered like a wound that would not heal. In the quiet of her chamber, she may have reached for the cradle that remained empty, her hands brushing wood that had never held laughter. That silence was the cruelest companion. It followed her through corridors, it echoed in the gardens, it clung to her during masses sung in Latin she barely understood. And yet, the pressure did not relent. The court expected her to try again and again until success or death. For in the medieval world, childbirth was as much a battlefield as any fought with swords. Women entered it with courage, but no certainty of survival. Each pregnancy was a gamble, each labor a crossing between life and death. Beatrice knew this truth intimately, and yet she was not given the choice to turn away. The parallels to her homeland must have haunted her. In Savoy, her father had played a dangerous balancing act between greater powers, each treaty a risk, each alliance a fragile thread. Now, Beatrice herself was caught in a similar balance. Her body became the treaty, her health the fragile thread. One failed pregnancy could weaken her position, another might end her life. She carried this burden at an age when many women today are only beginning to imagine adulthood. At 20, she should have been free to wander gardens, to laugh with companions, to dream of a future shaped by her own desires. Instead, she was a queen whose body was the battlefield of a dynasty. Her isolation deepened. Few at court were her allies. She had left her family far behind, and letters, if they reached her at all, could not replace the warmth of a mother's embrace or the comfort of a sister's words. The Hungarian nobles saw her as an outsider, a Savoyard girl who must prove herself by producing heirs. Until she did, she remained a stranger in their eyes, crowned yet not truly belonging. Her prayers must have grown more desperate. The chapels of Hungary, with their flickering candles and painted saints, bore witness to her whispered pleas. She prayed not for power or riches, but for a child who would survive, a child who would silence the whispers and give her purpose beyond exile. In those moments, the weight of heaven itself must have felt as heavy as the Anjou shadow pressing down upon her. But the heavens were silent, and the court was merciless. The obsession with an heir consumed everything. Even her moments of joy, perhaps laughter with a lady-in-waiting or a glimpse of sunlight through stained glass, were fleeting, overshadowed by the ever-present demand. Her life became a cycle of anticipation and disappointment, of hope kindled and then extinguished. And through it all, she aged far too quickly. Though still only 20, the burdens etched lines of weariness into her face, dimmed the sparkle in her eyes, and hollowed her spirit. The court did not notice, or if they did not care. They looked past the girl, past the queen, and saw only the future they demanded of her. The tragedy of Beatrice of Savoy is that her story was never hers to tell. From the moment of her birth, she was spoken for, first by her father, then by her husband, and finally by the court that consumed her. Her hopes were swallowed by dynastic ambition, her body treated as property, her grief dismissed as failure. And in the end, it was not her laughter or her kindness or even her suffering that history remembered, but the absence of what she was expected to give. The obsession with an heir had transformed her life into a waiting game she could never win. Each month was a question, each year a countdown. And behind it all loomed the certainty that if she did not produce the child the dynasty demanded, she would fade into silence. Beatrice of Savoy had become less a queen than a question mark, an unfinished sentence in the grand story of the Anjou. And as the years closed in around her, that question would be answered not with joy, but with tragedy. Youth is supposed to be a season of possibility, a chapter when horizons stretch wide and the air tastes of freedom. For Beatrice of Savoy, that season was stolen almost before it began. By the time she arrived in Hungary, she was still a teenager in body, but in spirit she was expected to carry the poise of a seasoned queen, the weight of dynastic survival, and the silence of one who could never complain. She was 20, perhaps 21, when the full measure of her loneliness began to consume her. The Hungarian court was a world of languages and customs foreign to her alpine upbringing. In Savoy, the wind carried the scent of pine and snow. In Hungary, the air was heavy with the smoke of hearths and the earthy smell of plains. The difference was more than geographical. It was cultural, spiritual, intimate. To walk through the halls of Buda or Visegrad was to wander in an alien maze. Courtiers exchanged knowing glances, whispered in a tongue that rolled harshly against her ears. Their music carried different cadences, their prayers different intonations. Beatrice, though crowned their queen, remained an outsider. The silks she wore marked her as noble, but the silence in her gaze betrayed her isolation. The court had little patience for her grief. To them, she was a vessel of dynastic ambition, not a girl robbed of a child. Her sorrow after her first stillbirth was never permitted to be truly hers. When she wept, it was seen not as the lament of a mother, but as a flaw in her duty. Her tears were judged like her womb, useful only if they could be transformed into strength for the dynasty. And yet, she was still so young. In another life, 20 might have meant afternoons spent by alpine lakes, laughter with companions, or whispered dreams of love. In Hungary, 20 meant silence, endurance, and submission. It meant swallowing grief without protest. Because a queen who faltered was a queen who risked exile in her own palace. Her husband, Charles I, was decades her senior. He had lived through conspiracies, uprisings, and endless negotiations. To him, the turbulence of his kingdom mattered far more than the turbulence of his young wife's heart. He was not cruel, but neither was he tender. His affections, if they existed, were buried beneath the armor of kingship. Beatrice sat beside him at feasts, her youth stark against his age, her silence a contrast to his commanding voice. In those banquets, surrounded by nobles and envoys, she played the part expected of her. She smiled faintly, raised her cup, and listened as others spoke. But inside, she must have felt as though she were fading. Every jewel placed upon her head glittered not as ornament, but as reminder. She was a symbol, not a soul. Loneliness gnawed at her like frost creeping into the bones. Without sisters or childhood friends, she leaned on ladies-in-waiting. Some loyal, others watchful. Perhaps a handful offered companionship, but even they could not erase the distance between queen and servant. She could not confess fully, nor could she escape the eyes that reported her moods back to the king. Every sigh risked being interpreted, every glance misread. The isolation grew sharper when she thought of Savoy. Letters from her homeland, if they arrived, were rare and often formal. Her father's ambitions had long since moved to other matters. Her mother's presence remained only in memory. Beatrice must have sat by her window at night, staring at the Hungarian sky, searching for constellations she had once traced in the Alps. The stars were the same, yet they felt further away, as though even the heavens had abandoned her to a foreign fate. The young queen's role was not only to bear children, but also to embody dignity. She could not voice her sorrow. She had to carry it with grace. And so she moved like a ghost through her palace. Her laughter muted, her steps careful, her face a mask. Her youth was withering, not from age, but from the relentless demand that she play a part she had never chosen. History often romanticizes queens, painting them as figures of grandeur, cloaked in velvet and adorned with crowns. But behind the stage, Beatrice's reality was more fragile. She was a girl robbed of choice, of comfort, of companionship. Her days blurred into rituals, morning prayers, formal audiences, evening masses. Between these duties, she endured the whispers, the judgments, and the endless waiting for another pregnancy that might redeem her. It is striking to imagine the contrast. In Savoy, the mountains had towered over her, fierce yet protective, guardians of her childhood. In Hungary, the endless plains stretched flat and merciless, leaving her exposed with no horizon to shield her. The Alps had felt like walls. The plains felt like emptiness. Both imprisoned her in different ways. And yet, despite this loneliness, she endured. Endurance became her defining quality, though no one praised it. She endured the court's scrutiny, the king's indifference, the weight of expectation, and the grief of loss. She endured the silences, the stares, the ceremonies that stripped her of individuality. Her youth was not a gift to be savored, but a resource to be consumed by others. In those brief moments when she might have found respite, in a garden, at a chapel, or in a fleeting conversation, perhaps she still clung to fragments of herself. A memory of her mother's lullaby, the smell of pine needles after snow, the laughter of sisters now far away. These fragments were not enough to save her, but they were enough to remind her that she had once been more than a queen. She had once been Beatrice. But the world of Hungary cared little for Beatrice the girl. They demanded Beatrice the mother, Beatrice the vessel, Beatrice the guarantee of dynasty. Her youth, fragile, fleeting, was sacrificed at the altar of power. She was 21 in age, but her eyes bore the fatigue of someone twice that. The shadow of the Anjou name had pressed her into maturity before her time. The tragedy of Beatrice is not only that she died young, it is that she was never truly allowed to live young. Her short life was stretched between expectation and grief, between a homeland that gave her away and a court that never welcomed her. Youth for her was not a season. It was a sacrifice, taken swiftly and silently, long before death itself came. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a door no woman could open without fear. Behind it might lie joy, but more often it concealed anguish. For Beatrice of Savoy, that door opened for the second and final time in the year 1331. She was not yet 21, but her body had already been claimed by a kingdom desperate for heirs. This pregnancy carried with it not just the hopes of Charles III, but of the Anjou dynasty itself. The court buzzed with anticipation. Servants whispered, midwives prepared linens and basins, priests readied prayers. The nobles of Hungary waited, their expectations heavy as winter clouds. For them, this was not merely the birth of a child. It was the securing of a dynasty. A son would be a shield against rebellion, a guarantee of stability. A daughter might disappoint, but at least it would prove the queen's womb was not barren. Failure, however, death of mother or child, would be more than tragedy. It would be scandal. Beatrice must have felt the pressure like a noose tightening around her neck. Months of carrying life had been accompanied not by the comfort of tender words, but by constant reminders of what was at stake. Every step she took through the palace was a performance. Every sign of fatigue was scrutinized. And now, as her body prepared for the most perilous trial of a medieval woman's existence, she stood on the precipice of both salvation and annihilation. The chambers where she labored were dim, lit by the glow of candles that flickered against walls draped in tapestries. The air was heavy with incense and hushed prayers, as if to mask the more human sounds of pain. Around her stood midwives, women hardened by experience, but powerless against fate. Their hands were skilled, but they knew well that skill often bowed to chance. For Beatrice, the pain was unrelenting. Labor in the 14th century offered no relief. No comfort beyond whispered prayers and herbal remedies of questionable use. Hours passed. The air grew thick with heat and sweat. Outside the chamber, courtiers paced, their anxiety less for the girl's life than for the promise of an heir. The queen's agony was reduced to a calculation. Would Hungary gain a son? Or would it lose a queen? As the ordeal dragged on, her strength waned. Youth had once been her only shield, but even youth could not withstand the storm raging within her. The midwives tried everything within their knowledge, tightening cloths, murmuring instructions, offering water, sprinkling holy words like salt upon a wound. But no prayer could cool the fever beginning to grip her body. Fever in childbirth was dreaded, a specter of death well known to medieval women. Once it took hold, hope began to fade. Beatrice's skin burned, her breathing grew shallow. Her face, once pale and serene, was contorted in pain. She was surrounded, yet utterly alone. Caught in the chasm between life and death, while others looked on helplessly. The child, too, did not survive. Another cradle sat empty, another thread of hope cut before it could be woven into the fabric of the dynasty. The silence that followed was more devastating than cries. Outside, the news spread in ripples of shock and disappointment. The nobles lowered their heads. The priests muttered prayers for her soul. Yet the sorrow of the court was not for Beatrice the woman. It was for the lost potential of a royal heir. Within the chamber, her final hours dwindled. Fever consumed her, each breath a battle. The midwives remained at her side, watching the light fade from her eyes. Perhaps a chaplain whispered words of absolution, placing a crucifix in her trembling hands. Perhaps she thought of Savoy, the mountains, the snow, the childhood that had felt like a different lifetime. In those last moments, the courtly masks fell away, and she was no longer a queen, but a frightened young woman facing the most human of endings. When she breathed her last, Hungary lost a queen, but Beatrice lost something far more precious: the years she had never been allowed to live. 21 summers were all she had been given, each one overshadowed by the demands of others. She had been born to serve alliances, married to secure a throne, and died to fulfill expectations she never had the chance to embrace as her own. The court, after the initial mourning, turned quickly back to politics. Charles I would marry again, still determined to secure his dynasty. Life in the palace resumed, as though Beatrice had been nothing more than a passing chapter. The halls she had walked soon echoed with new footsteps. The bed where she had labored would be prepared for another queen. Her presence, so fragile and brief, was absorbed into the endless cycle of dynastic ambition. And yet, her death was not entirely without meaning. It illuminated the cruel truth of her age, that women, even queens, were expendable. Their lives were measured not in their humanity, but in their usefulness. Beatrice's tragedy was not unique. Across Europe, countless young women faced the same fate, their names erased, their youth consumed by childbirth, their stories forgotten. She was one of many. And in that anonymity lay the deepest cruelty of all. Imagine the silence after her passing, the extinguished candles, the abandoned cradle, the faint smell of incense lingering in the chamber. That silence is the echo of countless lives cut short, countless voices never heard. Beatrice's death is not only her own story, but the story of an entire generation of women whose sacrifices were buried beneath the grandeur of crowns. History records the year of her death, the name of her husband, and the dynasty she was meant to serve. But it does not record her thoughts, her fears, her final prayers. Those belong only to her, and perhaps to us, who remember now. To look at her life is to glimpse the human cost behind the glittering facade of medieval royalty. It is to understand that beneath every crown was a heart that beat, often in fear, often in silence, until it could beat no more. Beatrice of Savoy died in 1331, and with her passing, the silence of the court was not the silence of grief, but the silence of erasure. In Hungary, a queen who left no heir was like a book with blank pages, acknowledged perhaps, but quickly shelved and forgotten. Her life ended at 21, her body consumed by fever and labor. But her memory was consumed by something colder: indifference. The news of her death spread through the palace corridors quickly, as if carried not by mourners, but by messengers hurrying to deliver a fact. The queen was gone. The child was gone. The dynasty remained unsatisfied. The king still needed an heir. That was the sum of it. For the courtiers, the loss was less a tragedy than an inconvenience, a shift in strategy. Charles III mourned, perhaps, in his own way. He was not made of stone, though history does not grant him tenderness. He had lost wives before, had endured dynastic disappointments, had watched as women died carrying the hopes of his crown. He may have felt sorrow at her passing, but his grief would have been buried beneath the urgency of the kingship. The throne could not pause for mourning. A kingdom demanded stability, and stability demanded succession. And so Beatrice's death, like her life, was folded into the relentless machinery of power. Priests said masses, courtiers wore black, the rituals of mourning were observed. But behind the ceremony, eyes were already turning toward the future. Who would Charles marry next? Who would bear the son that Beatrice could not? The silence of her passing was the silence of replacement. For Hungary, she became a footnote. Chronicles recorded her as Beatrice of Savoy, queen consort, died in childbirth. No mention of her laughter, her isolation, her grief. No record of her prayers or her private longings. She was reduced to a date, a cause of death, a missing heir. The grandeur of the crown that had crushed her now swept over her memory, smoothing it flat until almost nothing remained. Her burial was likely conducted with dignity, as befitted a queen. Incense hung in the air, bells tolled softly, priests recited scripture. Yet even that solemn ritual was tinged with finality, not just of life, but of relevance. A queen without heirs was a queen without legacy. And in medieval Europe, legacy was the only language history understood. In Savoy, news of her death must have reached her family weeks or months later. Her father had already passed. Her mother may have mourned from afar. But even in Savoy, her death was unlikely to linger. She had been given away, and her loss was no longer theirs to carry. Another daughter of Savoy had been consumed by dynastic politics, and the cycle continued. This was the cruel reality of queenship in her age. Lives offered up like sacrifices, names erased unless tethered to sons who would rule. Beatrice's death was not exceptional, it was typical. That, perhaps, is the greatest tragedy. She was not remembered because there were so many like her. So many young women who walked into palaces as brides and left as corpses before they had truly lived. And yet, if we look closer, we can see the faint outlines of her humanity. She was 21. She had grown up in the shadows of the Alps, a girl who might once have dreamt of freedom, of love, of laughter echoing through valleys of pine. She had crossed mountains and rivers to reach Hungary, had worn the crown with grace, had endured loss with silence. And then, in one final act demanded of her, she had given her life. The court did not speak of her courage. It did not honor her endurance. But we can. To die in childbirth was not weakness. It was a risk forced upon her, a battle she never chose. Beatrice's death is not merely the absence of an heir. It is the presence of sacrifice. A sacrifice demanded by dynasties that consumed women like kindling in the fire of ambition. Her story faded quickly. Charles III remarried, taking new brides to continue the quest for sons. The Anjou dynasty pressed forward as ruthless as the tide. Hungary moved on. The world moved on. Beatrice was left behind. But her silence speaks across centuries. In the stillness of her end, we hear the echoes of countless women whose names were lost, whose lives were shortened, whose youth was stolen. Her death was not singular. It was part of a pattern that stretched across the medieval Europe, where queens were remembered only if they succeeded in their biological duty. She did not, and so history closed its eyes. Imagine her chamber in those final hours after her passing. The bedsheets stained by labor, the candles extinguished one by one, the air heavy with the fading smell of incense. Servants moved quietly, gathering linens, preparing the room for its next occupant. Outside, the palace continued its rhythm, feasts to plan, alliances to secure, wars to anticipate. Life did not pause. The world did not mourn. Only silence remained. It is in that silence that Beatrice's true tragedy lies. Not just that she died young, but that her death was accepted without outrage, without shock, without remembrance. She was buried not only in the earth, but in the apathy of those she had served. Her crown, heavy in life, proved weightless in death. The Alps that had shaped her childhood outlasted her by centuries. They stand even now, eternal, indifferent. Perhaps that is fitting. For while the courts of Hungary erased her, the mountains of her birth would remember her in their own way. In the snow that falls silently each winter, in the valleys that hold echoes of forgotten voices, in the peaks that remain unmoved by the games of kings. Beatrice of Savoy died as countless queens did, young, unfulfilled, erased. But to tell her story now is to resist that erasure. It is to say her name again, to recognize her youth not as failure, but as theft. She was more than a missing heir. She was a girl turned queen, a queen turned shadow, and finally a shadow turned silence. The life and death of Beatrice of Savoy were not singular tragedies. They were threads woven into a tapestry of countless other young women who met similar fates, their stories silenced beneath the grandeur of crowns. In medieval Europe, political marriage was less a union of hearts than a transaction of power. Behind every bridal procession and every gilded crown lay a cost, often paid in the blood and breath of the bride herself. For dynasties, daughters were currency. They were the glue-binding treaties, the bridges between rival houses, the insurance policies against war. Their bodies became bargaining chips, their wombs battlegrounds where the survival of dynasties was decided. Queens were measured not by their wisdom, not by their compassion, but by the sons they produced. If they succeeded, they were praised, though rarely celebrated for themselves. If they failed, they were forgotten. Beatrice's story mirrors this cruel arithmetic. Sent from Savoy at 18, married into Hungary's Anjou court, she was consumed by a role she did not choose. Her life was defined by expectation and erased by failure. She bore no living heir, and so history regarded her not as a person, but as an absence, a queen who did not deliver. That silence is as telling as any chronicle. The cost of such marriages was more than individual lives. It was the withering of entire generations of women whose voices never reached the page. Across Europe, royal daughters entered marriages that pulled them far from their homes, stripped them of kinship, and placed them in courts where affection was scarce and duty absolute. Some survived, enduring in silence. Others, like Beatrice, died before they had lived at all. These were not accidents of fate. They were consequences of design. Political marriage was constructed as a strategy, a system that sacrificed women for the ambitions of men. The Alps that raised Beatrice did not protect her from this machinery. The crown placed on her head was not a gift, but a cage. Her death in childbirth was not a cruel twist of destiny. It was the inevitable result of a world that demanded her body serve a throne. We see the cost most clearly in what is missing. There are no letters from Beatrice that survived, no chronicles of her thoughts, no portraits capturing her face. Her humanity has been stripped down to a line in genealogies. Beatrice of Savoy, Queen of Hungary, died in childbirth, aged 21. The brevity of that record is its own indictment. For a dynasty, she was a failure. For us, she is a silence that speaks volumes. The cost of political marriage was not only borne by the women themselves, but also by the societies that erased them. Dynasties rose and fell on the sacrifices of queens. Yet the names of those queens often vanished from memory. Power built on silence carries within it a fracture, a moral debt unpaid. To remember Beatrice now is to acknowledge that debt, to see not just the cost to her, but to all who followed her path. Her story lingers as a reminder. Political marriages were victories for kings, but often death sentences for queens. The crowns they wore glistened in the torchlight of ceremonies, but their edges cut deep. Beatrice's brief life shows us the underside of medieval power. The human lives extinguished, the youth consumed, the voices erased. The cost of political marriage was not gold or silver, but the beating hearts of young women who were never allowed to be more than symbols. Beatrice of Savoy was one of them. And though history sought to bury her in silence, to speak of her now is to break the pattern, to say that her sacrifice was not invisible, nor was it without meaning. Beatrice of Savoy left this world in silence, and silence became her legacy. History, preoccupied with kings and heirs, let her name fade into the margins. No statue honors her, no chapel bears her likeness. She exists today only in scattered lines of genealogy, the faint trace of a queen who passed through Hungary like a shadow across stone. Yet silence does not mean absence. Sometimes silence is the loudest witness of all. To remember Beatrice is to confront the cruelty of forgetting. She was not a failure, though dynasties judged her as such. She was not a blank page, though chronicles reduced her to one. She was a daughter, a bride, a young woman who carried both hope and sorrow in equal measure. Her tragedy is not only that she died at 21, but that her humanity was never acknowledged by those who demanded everything from her. Silence also speaks of resilience. In the hush of her story, we hear the echo of countless other women who endured the same fate. Queens, princesses, noble daughters whose names rarely crossed the threshold of history books. They lived, they suffered, they died, and the world moved on. But to say their names now is to pierce that silence, to reclaim the dignity stripped from them. Beatrice's voice, though lost, returns in our telling. Her story is also a mirror. The court of Hungary saw her only as a vessel, and when the vessel broke, it discarded her. That indifference reflects a timeless truth. Societies that value people only for their usefulness will always leave behind ruins of forgotten lives. Beatrice's death is not just a medieval tragedy. It is a warning written across centuries. The measure of a life should never be confined to what it produces, but to the humanity it carries. Imagine her for a moment, not as a queen, but as a girl of 21. She might have stood by the palace window, gazing at the Hungarian horizon. She might have thought of Savoy's snow-capped peaks, of the scent of pine, of the laughter of sisters now far away. She might have whispered prayers into the darkness, asking not for power or glory, but for love, for a child's laughter, for a moment of peace. In those imaginings, we restore her humanity. We remember that beneath the crown was a beating heart. Silence also carries remembrance. Each winter, when snow falls across the Alps of her childhood, it is as though the mountains themselves speak her name. Each time we tell her story, we undo the erasure inflicted by dynasties. We remind ourselves that Beatrice of Savoy was not simply a failed queen, but a life cut short by forces beyond her control. The silence of her death room, the silence of her empty cradle, the silence of history's neglect. These are not voids, but spaces where her story lingers, waiting to be heard. And when we hear it, we confront not only her tragedy, but the humanity of all who have been forgotten. Beatrice's memory may never be carved in marble, but it does not need to be. It survives in the telling, in the acknowledgement that her life mattered even if her dynasty dismissed it. To speak her name now is to lift her from the silence and grant her the remembrance she was denied. History often celebrates kings, warriors, and conquerors. But the truest measure of a civilization lies in how it remembers the forgotten. The young queens who died in childbirth, the daughters traded for treaties, the women whose youth was devoured by crowns. Beatrice of Savoy stands among them, a reminder that every silence has a voice if we choose to listen. She was 21. She was a daughter of the Alps, a queen of Hungary, a young woman caught in the machinery of power. Her silence is not the silence of nothingness. It is the silence that demands we remember, so that her story and the stories of countless others like her do not vanish into the shadows again.